It feels almost performative at this point to say that the world has caught fire, but while I was writing this video, it literally did. I suppose this is something that every generation has to go through at some point. That sense that everyone has just effed things up and there's seemingly no stopping the downward spiral into disinformation, war, climate collapse, fascism, and any other sad, depressing, horrifying and/or angry thing you can think of. We've had plenty of close calls the past 9,000 odd years of civilization, and we've survived all of those, so I'd like to believe we can do the same now, but with so many quick and easy updates of the atrocities happening all over the world, from the loud and terrifying to the almost subtle and insidious, a certain degree of faith is necessary to keep that belief up. When I find myself falling into that kind of despair, which is unfortunately often nowadays, what I find tends to drag me out of that hole and help remind me that we are worth fighting for is art. The gift of human expression in the form of creativity is almost enough to make me want to believe in God. It's a way of connecting to humanity. Seeing or hearing a person's sheer, overwhelming passion given form is such a fulfilling experience. I'd almost call it a rejuvenation. Maybe it's a deep, intricately woven and nuanced depiction of the human condition, something that really encourages me to think about the world and the ways in which it operates. Or it embodies emotion and feeling so powerful like can't help but cry, can't help but get swept up in all the romanticism. Sometimes it's an out-of-the-box exploration of form and function, taking the world around us and twisting it in ways never before thought. Sometimes it's a stupid, absurd, but masterfully purposeful ode to the euphoria of just experience. But sometimes all I need, all I want, is to see that despair, that fear and rage reflected back at me, to have those feelings acknowledged, shared and actualized, to know I'm not alone in this. The past several months, I found that feeling more often than not in the form of music, one of my favourite art forms in general, be that albums made only within the past year, or even older stuff that I've been listening to for some time, whose aspects I've come to appreciate even more as I myself got older. Consider this video part analysis, part review, part recommendation, because while it is obviously very important to have hope, to have joy, sometimes we do need someone to tell you, don't worry, you aren't the only one. I also kinda hate things too.
More bass drum for Luther Manhole, please, in the monitor. If possible, thank you much.
Chat Pile was my first experience with the genre known as sludge metal, a genre that, if my limited experience is anything to go by, absolutely lives up to its name. Defined by slow, churning and extremely heavy sounds. Listening to their songs is like trying to wade through an ocean of mud while a heavy metal festival is going on in the background. Such an abrasive, noisy band would have been plenty appealing to me already. Not to brag, but I took Pulse Demon without flinching. But what really pushes Chat Pile over the finish line for me are their lyrics and their vocals, delivered by the wonderful, Raygun Bush. It's a pseudonym apparently. Like the instrumentation, Raygun's vocals are often very odd, slurry and coarse. They are far from what you might expect from a traditional lead singer. A lot of the time they sound less like singing and more like the ravings of a very drunk, very depressed man screaming in fury at the cruelty of an indifferent world. That might sound like a funny ha-ha description, but I mean that with sincerity and as the highest praise, especially when paired with Chat Pile's brutally honest lyrics. They don't leave a single thing up to chance or interpretation or misunderstanding. Take their debut album, God's Country, which is themed around the unending conga line of American tragedy. The second track, Why, is a ruthless piece about the cruel absurdity of homelessness, especially in a supposedly developed and wealthy country like the US. The resources are there, the means are there, the buildings are definitely there. There are 15 to 16 million vacant homes in the US. Knowing this, what else can you say other than why?
Why do people have to live outside? In the brutal heat, or when it's below freezing, there are people that are made to live outside.
Anywhere is this awful tale of a sudden mass shooting. 1 second the narrator is walking with his loved ones, just happy to be with them, only for that world to be torn apart by bullets as everyone around him is slaughtered. There's some really horrifying imagery here. The third verse is especially visceral. Coming up from the earth, standing up from the ground. Blood on my face, blood on my pants, running like hell from the sound. As someone who is fortunate enough to live in a country that doesn't see widespread gun violence, and you can't tell me that having more mass shootings than days in the year is anything less than a fucking epidemic, this song gives me a glimpse into how genuinely horrifying living in that kind of reality is. Like, let's be real here, the entire country is PTSD at this point. Almost as if to parallel this, the album later features a second shooting-themed song, The Mask. This one more directly based on an actual shooting, specifically the 1978 Sirloin Stockade shooting, carried out by serial killer Roger Dale Stafford. It reminds me of Eminem's song Darkness, in that they're both songs about mass shootings written from the perspective of the perpetrator, though The Mask is noticeably more intense. Another reoccurring theme on the record is drug addiction. This is a topic that comes up on the song Wicked Puppet Dance, which describes a man with fucked up skin thanks to the vein stuff, imagining roaches in the walls, murdering a man and then setting his house on fire, likening his addiction to being held prisoner by strings, dancing to the will of something out of his control. But if you want to talk Chat Pile songs about drug addiction, there's really one song that stands above the rest, and that is the album's closing track, Grimace_smoking_weed.jpg. Grimace_smoking_weed.jpg is a 9-minute descent into madness and inarguably the album's crown jewel. As I was writing this script, I, maybe not surprisingly, was in my feelings a little bit, and I may or may not have decided to add a mug of Jack Daniels to my re-listening of this song. And let me tell you, listening to a man kill himself over a corporate monster while your body rapidly desyncs from your mind is an experience that actually made the track hit harder, which I am appreciative for, even if I'd never want to do it again. The song is written from the perspective of a user who, in a heroin-fueled delusional episode, pictures a purple man, aka Grimace, entering his room smoking weed and kinda just vaguely menacing him with his presence. The narrator screams at him to leave and, in a last-ditch effort to escape him, throws himself out the window. The song is unfucking hinged. There's a section where the narrator just matter-of-factly explains to Grimace that he locked the door to kill himself and would really appreciate it if he could be left alone.
I'm trying to kill myself. If you don't mind, that's why I locked the door.
Obviously, Grimace here is meant to represent something more than just ha-ha funny purple mascot smoking weed. I think Grimace specifically represents some kind of deep emotional trauma that the narrator suffered. Maybe a person he has a great amount of fear and resentment for. Possibly even the catalyst that drove him into using heroin to try and escape, though it ultimately seems like said drug has only driven him back to where he started. Listen, I don't want your presence, purple man smoking weed in my bedroom. Don't want you, I don't need you, and don't think I'd forget that you hurt me in a past life, and you were so strange once, at least stranger than you are now, at least stranger than you are now. This is followed by a section where phrases like, I want to wear your flesh, I want to be you, I'm a monster too are repeated, which to me suggests that his heroin abuse has not only familiarized him with Grimace, but turned the narrator into no less of a horror than Grimace, or whatever it is that Grimace represents. In the end, he cannot deny what he is anymore, and he hurls himself to his death, finally acknowledging what he sees and what he is. There is so much more I want to talk about in regards to this album. Originally, I was hoping to include a section about their second album, Cool World, which came out last year, and if this was just a video about Chat Pile, I absolutely would. But as a section in a wider video, I couldn't let this drag on too much. I couldn't even find a place to talk about I Don't Care If I Burn, which is my favourite track on God's Country, and if I had to describe it in one sentence, I would say it was pure, naked malice, and probably the most terrifying song on the album, but I'll have to leave you to hear it and Cool World for yourself. At the start of this segment, I described Chat Pile's music as a very depressed man ranting in fury as he lies drunk in the gutter, and again, let me reiterate, I mean that 100% as a compliment. There is a bluntness to Chat Pile's music that just makes them hit so hard. They feel so unfiltered and raw that listening to them is almost a cathartic experience. Everything that makes them good can be heard on God's Country, and I highly recommend you listen. Though, be warned, it ain't for the faint of heart.
If I love you, I can't lie to you.
Of course you can lie to me, and you will. If you love me and you're going off with Maddie someplace, you're lying to.
In a sense, you wouldn't be wrong to say that Dark Times is a strange kind of brother to Chat Pile's music, in that it also feels like it comes from the same place. Vince Staples' latest LP has, hanging over it, the same sense of destitution, weariness and grief over the state of the world that an album like God's Country has. The key difference being, whereas Chat Pile channels that emotion into rage, madness and fear, Vince's anxieties and worries manifest into something a lot more cold, moody and melancholic. To go back to my earlier analogy, if God's Country is a drunk man raging at the world in confused indignation, Dark Times is someone aimlessly driving at 3 AM, too tired and depressed to care about their life falling apart around them. A vibe the album wastes no time in establishing with the intro Close Your Eyes and Swing, which despite only being 30 seconds long, is already giving us food for thought. The track starts off very calm and soothing, being a soundscape of birds singing, children playing and wind chimes chiming, but as it goes on, these dark, unnatural drones start creeping into the mix. Soon after, a voice speaks the line, "To live is to be, like the nigger in the tree." I've seen multiple interpretations of this one line, ranging from swinging from the tree like a child on a swing set, to hanging from the tree like you've just been lynched. Surprisingly, I think both are actually valid interpretations, which we can see in the song Government Cheese. Lyrically, Government Cheese is about trying to find the light in the darkness. The verses are all about the blood sport that is survival in the hood, both in the moment trying to succeed and even after you've managed to escape. In the first verse, Vince questions whether his all is even enough to succeed, feeling that each passing day is nothing more than another step towards his inevitable demise, and though he has love for those he keeps around him, The life they are forced to live has them questioning whether they'll make it into heaven, or if the choices they have to make to survive are only condemning them to something even worse. The second verse deals with the struggles of Vince being the only one in his hood to actually make it out and have to look back at his friends still stuck where they are. He describes talking to a friend in prison who mentioned seeing him on a sitcom on TV, and Vince struggles to tell him how much he's actually struggling, knowing these 15 minutes they spend together are the closest he's ever going to get to genuine freedom. The verse ends with him recounting the death of his brother, having to pull the plug on him presumably due to a terminal condition. When he tries to question why this had to be, the only answer he can think of is that those are the cards God dealt him. And then you have the chorus, just don't forget to smile, don't forget to smile. No, the world can weigh you down, not now, then when, not this, then how. Don't forget to smile, don't forget to smile. Don't lose your inner child now. There are two ways to interpret this. Take a shot every time I say that. You have the cynical way, where Vince is saying all this as a way to ignore the bad things in the world the way a child is. This is backed up by the title, which references the hundreds of millions of kilograms of cheese that were given freely to US citizens, partially as a way to help food insecurity, but also largely because the US government just had too much fucking cheese. Still, sounds great until you realise that this was done by the Reagan administration, which at the time was slashing benefits and welfare across the board, including the budget for food stamps. Therefore, it could be argued that drowning people in free cheese was a way to distract them as he reached into their back pockets and took away their means of buying actual food, probably so he could shove it all into the military or some shit. There's also the alternative that Vince is saying this genuinely, that in order to survive the dangerous and traumatic world that exists below the poverty line, one where people are encouraged to fight and kill each other for scraps, you need to keep a little bit of that innocence alive, even if it's by doing something as small and simple as just smiling a little bit more. I'm especially drawn to the line, "Don't lose your inner child, not now." As if confirming, yes, it is in these darkest, saddest moments that it is most important, more so than any other time, to keep that sense of joy and happiness by any means necessary. The line and the differing thoughts it generates leads nicely into the following track, Children's Song. One of the more genuinely warm and pleasant beats on the album, Vince describes the way his life has changed for the better, while dangers and trauma from his days in the slums still haunt him. It brings forth imagery of him riding a bike in a classy, high-end neighbourhood while still keeping his gun on him. When he returns home for the night, he tells the listener to not disturb him, to not intrude in this part of his life. As he says, "Gotta keep this shit bliss, gotta keep this shit ignorant." Despite this mantra, Vince goes on to prove he can't stay like that. The very next track, Shame on the Devil, shows a longing for love and affection. Despite access to fame, money and sex, none of those things have brought him any closer to either. Admitting himself to be imperfect and sending messages over talking on the phone, a sign of the disconnect between both himself and his partner, but also wider humanity in general. The standout line of this song is, "I know some hoes that'll pull up to give me some pussy before they give me a hug," which again shows how warped and disconnected humans are from each other, that sex is easier and less of an investment than something that should be far less intimate. This all culminates in my favourite track of the album, Nothing Matters, which just radiates this bittersweet acceptance, throwing your hands up and shrugging your shoulders and going, whatever. The band plays on like it's supposed to, follow suit, cause it ain't nothing new. Beneath the solar systems of oppression got me aloof. This whole first verse is about how the weight of systemic cruelty just numbs you, eventually leaving you in a state where you just go through the motions, unable to do anything else. The chorus reframes it in a more personal way, but still keeps those same emotions. Vince asking, why would you tell me you love me when you don't? Why would you make a promise you could never keep? Before shrugging it off because nothing matters. It is a powerful expression of nihilism, one that puts you in his headspace perfectly, and hasn't left mine since I first heard it.
Nothing really matters at all. Nothing really matters. nothing really matters at all.
I could go on, but remember, this video is part recommendation, and I want to leave you with something to discover when you hopefully listen to this album if you haven't already. But to close things off, Dark Times really lives up to its name in the best way, and was a phenomenal introduction to Vince Staples, who I'd previously heard mostly through his collaborations with other artists, like Kendrick Lamar on the Black Panther soundtrack, and Gorillaz on Humanz.
And now, let's repeat the non-conformist oath.
I am the Groot.
2017's Humanz was the comeback album for the world's biggest virtual band after a half-decade hiatus, and without question is also its most divisive. From what I can tell, the majority of the complaints lie with the fact that lead singer 2D, aka Damon Albarn, has a diminished vocal presence compared to other albums and is somewhat drowned out by the abundance of guest performers. While I understand that, especially with the context of this being the first new Gorillaz album in 7 years, I think dismissing it on those grounds ignores not only the very long history of Gorillaz as a collaborative project, not only the fact that they are more than just one, admittedly iconic voice, but also what this specific record is going for. Simply put, Humanz is a house party at the end of the world. When starting recording for the album in September 2015, Damon and his producers went in with the intent of creating this kind of dark fantasy world, a world where something has happened, something to completely turn the world on its head, leaving humanity at large left wondering just what on earth to do now. Simply put, we're in transition, we're turning into something else, Albarn said of the album's narrative. The album kinda came from this dark fantasy. Just imagine the weirdest, most unpredictable thing that changes everything in the world. How would you feel on that night? Would you go out and get drunk? Would you stay at home, just watch TV? Would you talk to people? In order to help establish this tone, Albarn would, later instructing his collaborators to do the same, imagine a future where Donald Trump wins the 2016 US presidential election. Co-producer Anthony Khan, aka The Twilight Tone, wanted the album to be about joy, pain and urgency, all things that can be heard on the album's first proper track, Ascension, featuring Vince Staples. Ascension is pretty much the album's tone setter, the instrumental in Vince painting this perfect image of a world descending into chaos. People are running in the streets, shit's falling from the sky, the apocalypse is no longer nigh, it's just straight up here, and Vince has one thing on his mind. I gotta get my dick wet.
The sky's falling, baby, drop that ass for a crack.
I think that one line there just tells you the whole idea of the album. It's the end of the world, all hope has been lost, so let's have a fucking good time while we can, cause what else can we do at this point? It makes me think of like those early 2010s Pitbull songs that are like mindless hype, but when you actually listen to the lyrics, they're strangely ominous, always talking about how this is the last night, we might not get tomorrow, call it YOLO or whatever, but here, it's like if that undertone was just brought to the forefront and pushed to its logical extreme, painting the scene of one last night of debauchery before everything comes to an end. But don't worry, because the party's only just getting started. Generally, the album can be split into distinct phases as marked by the various Ben Mendelsohn interludes. These aren't hard cuts or shifts, but they do act as a general mark of progression throughout the track list, and the first 4 tracks on the album act to sink us into this world, this party of final days, to prep us for the rest of the album. You have Strobe Light with Pevin Everett, a funky disco track, Everett playing the part of the lure, wondering if humanity is too far apart to join together again, but promising that pain can very quickly turn into pleasure. Moments with frequent collaborators De La Soul is this demented electronic banger about reckless hedonism, poster notes encouraging the listener to stop worrying about time and to live in the moment. And of course, how could I forget the big single off the album, Saturn's Bars? A haunting dance hall trip-hop fusion. It stars Popcan as he boasts of the struggles he's overcome to find the success he deserves. Only to be followed by 2D, who, his voice draped in static, wails about the distance between himself and those he loves, surrounded by nothing but empty holograms. This theme of willful ignorance and disconnect is one that echoes throughout the entire album, and with the world and atmosphere established, each subsequent track feels like it's diving into a new aspect of that world, and though I can't talk about all of them, I will go through some of the highlights. Submission, my favourite track on the album, is a dark club instrumental that acts as the scene for a relationship, acted out by Kelela and Danny Brown. The former sings about how the emotional absence of her partner, his inability to connect with her, is hurting her, is causing her harm. Meanwhile, Danny Brown is trapped in his own head, so blinded by his own suffering that he can't see that he has someone willing to help and support him right next to him. Shortly afterwards is Busted and Blue, which is noticeably the only track without a featured artist, and in an album almost bursting with them, that feels like a very deliberate choice. In the song, 2D seemingly sings from the perspective of a satellite high in Earth's orbit, both connected to and isolated from the world, asking where the wires connecting us actually come from. As he amplifies sirens and flies through echo chambers, he records the All My Life refrain from Saturn's Bars and begins reaching out, begging for someone to be his love, his light. Even in an album stuffed to bursting with collaborators, there are still moments of crippling isolation. Even at the party to end all parties, there are still moments where you can't help but feel so terribly alone. I'd be remiss to not bring up some of the more overtly political songs on the album as well. There's Carnival with Anthony Hamilton, whose smooth, soulful vocals meet with this twisted, ominous instrumental to create a song that, I believe, references the Roman-era phrase, bread and circuses, which posits that you can do whatever you want as a government, and the people will still love you, provided you can offer up a suitable distraction and/or palliative, like food or entertainment. It's hard not to think of this phrase as more than a little timeless, with the rich and wealthy doing everything they can to convince us that they really are on our side, keeping us distracted with bullshit culture wars while they plunder our countries for wealth to add to their already stupid piles of money. Speaking of wealthy elites, I think they're also the subject of the next song, Sex Murder Party, which, in the lore of the album, takes place in a penthouse, presumably high above the decay and ruin happening beneath. In all likelihood, it was these very people who ruined the earth, spelling its doom, yet they are the only ones to escape the worst of it as it crumbles. As 2D sings on the hook, dissolve the keys in the seas of your priorities. The verses from Jamie Principle and Zebra Cat detail someone who, seeing the horrors around them, attempt to flee this environment they've been raised in, but are ultimately unable to escape what's been instilled in them, finding themselves trapped and unable to escape. And of course there's Let Me Out with Pusha T and Mavis Staples, but unlike most other tracks on the album, there's a unique sense of defiance on this track. Pusha T goes over the struggles of his life, asking his mother to look him in the eyes and promise him that there is a hope of something greater than what he has now. The line, "Promise me I won't outlive my nephew and my niece," was already a poignant one, but really hits different when you actually have nephews and nieces. Lines like, "You have to die to live a little, promise pain, yes, but also something beyond. That the ashes of the world around us will serve to bring about something new and better." Side note, I think it's funny that despite this being one of Gorillaz' most overtly political albums, Damon Albarn censored Pusha T's mentioning of Obama and Trump. And like, I kinda understand his reasoning, but like, if you're gonna tell the man to write a future where Trump is president, maybe don't be surprised when he mentions him by name. There's so much more of this album to talk about. It's the longest I'm talking about today, and has by far the most amount of tracks, especially if you count the deluxe edition, which I do. I think they do add to the narrative and canon of the album.
I ain't touching the super deluxe though, Jesus wept.
So once again, I gotta cut myself off somewhere. But to close things out, let's briefly talk about the closing track, Circle of Friends, featuring Brandon Markle Holmes.
The song begins with a soundscape of distant bells, creaks and chattering as glass shatters, people chatter and sirens wail. All very keeping in the post-apocalyptic vibe. However, the strings that begin creeping in sound, yes, melancholic, but also oddly bright and hopeful. The crowds strangely calm. This leads into Brandon, whose warm and kind repetition of the title, backed by 2D and the Humanz choir, takes up the bulk of the track, only interrupted by the Gorillaz lead singer occasionally saying, "Every day, see the world brand new."
Circle of Friends is, to me, the morning after the party at the end of the world. People are walking around, picking through the ruins and coming to terms with the new world they're in. Nothing will be the same, and they have no idea what's going to happen. However, though they have lost everything, they still have each other. There is still friendship, love, and companionship, because no matter the society, those things are just inherent to being human, and they are still human. The image I get of this song is a bunch of friends in a bombed out house getting high on weed or some shit. I don't know if they'd still be able to get that, but that's the image that comes to mind. I think ultimately what Humanz is trying to say is that when things go south, when the world looks set for destruction and there's nothing you can do, the thing that will help us get through it and at least live to see some sort of future isn't escapism or ignorance or alienation. It's our bonds and connections with other people that will. Our circle of friends.
Now I want you to forget about all that talk of friendship and hope and all that other bullshit. Because on this next album, things are gonna get depressing. Very damn depressing.
Remember, what happens on Earth stays on Earth.
I said I'm deep and I'm fired up.
I'm gonna be real, I have wanted to talk about this album for a long time. Really, ever since I made my Bad Music by Bad People video a year and a bit ago. Maybe even before that.
In that video, the section dedicated to Kendrick Lamar was focused on his most recent album at the time, Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers. However, I segued into that album by talking a bit about Damn, and how Mr. Morale retroactively positions that album as the perfect prequel. It kinda reminds me of how Tokyo Metropolitan Technical School became Jujutsu Kaisen Volume 0. I don't even like JJK like that. Why did I make that reference?
Damn, in my opinion, is Kendrick Lamar's most underrated album, and I mean that in a very specific way, because hearing me say that, I imagine more than a few of you laughed. This is Damn, Kendrick's best-selling album with his biggest ever hits on it. He won a fucking Pulitzer for it. How is it underrated? Well, I think the answer is in that success to a degree.
People see the massive numbers, the big bangers, the Rihanna and U2 features, and dismiss this as Kendrick's most commercial, radio-friendly and thin body of work, when compared to the more conceptual and or hard-hitting albums that have come before and after, at least until GNX came out. And while in one sense that isn't wrong, I think it is a very big generalization to call it that, because I am of the opinion that Damn is Kendrick Lamar's darkest album, or at least he was at the darkest emotional point in his life while writing it.
Because if this album is about one thing, it is about Kendrick's struggle to find faith in a world he has all but given up hope for, something that becomes immediately apparent on the opening track Blood, where Kendrick goes to help a blind woman search for something she's lost, only for her to shoot him dead on the spot. Yeah, we ain't playing. let's just get into this.
If I had to try and summarize Damn's overall vibe, it would be that of a depressive episode, broken up by explosive and sporadic moments of energy and rage. You have songs like Yah, Feel, Lust, Pride, these slower, down-tempo and melancholic tracks that just hang with this bone-deep weariness. Occasionally and suddenly, these are interrupted by songs like DNA, Element and Humble, far more confrontational and high energy, but those quickly fade as we swing back to the vibe of the aforementioned tracks. It's like Kendrick is trapped in a deep depression, occasionally stepping forward and screaming in frustration, only for the energy to fizzle out and he slinks back into the shadows. Like if Dark Times was spliced with the occasional track from God's Country or one of the more hype cuts off Humanz. And if there's a song that acts as a perfect microcosm for this, it's XXX featuring U2.
The song starts off with this languid, even mildly psychedelic intro that includes one of my favourite lines off the album, "America, God bless you if it's good to ya," before being interrupted by this faster but still dreary beat as Kendrick in a tired tone raps about being tested like Jesus in the wilderness, as well as apathy, black youths finding no hope in academia and turning to things like hustling and rapping. Then suddenly there's a massive surge of frantic energy, the beat almost morphing into a siren as Kendrick launches into one of the most aggressive verses on the album, detailing a phone call he had with a grieving father, asking the spiritually enlightened Kung Fu Kenny to pray for him, to give him advice on how to deal with the death of his son, only for Kendrick to flat out dismiss him and go, "Nah man, someone touches my son, there will be bodies in the street by sunset." Only for all of this violence to get cut off by,
Alright kids, we're gonna talk about gun control.
Pray for me.
Before transitioning into this slow, stripped back beat, Bono is smooth on the hook, singing about America not being a place, not existing in reality, but in sounds. It is a mere notion. Kendrick is the one who describes what real America looks like, one of corporate killers, institutional racism, and Donald Trump. The more things change, am I right? You can see this dichotomy all over the album. Tracks are paired together and seem deliberately arranged to contrast and reference each other. But across nearly all of them is that same sense of, I almost want to say, apathy.
This is the first Kendrick album rollout that I was actually paying attention to. The lead single, Humble, actually dropped on my 15th birthday, but I imagine that for people who had just listened to Pimp a Butterfly, this was quite the sudden shift.
That album, while it obviously didn't shy away from the grave realities of being black in America, also made sure to include plenty moments of love, joy and optimism that celebrated the black experience, encouraging people to enrich and defend it. But if TPAB is a rallying cry, a call to action, Damn is almost like giving up that action. Like realizing that the issues talked about on TPAB are so much bigger and more evil than you could have ever imagined, and just letting exhaustion wash over you. And in no track is that feeling exemplified more than Feel. Feel is just defeat. This dark, moody and jazzy beat, which features bass from Thundercat, does a phenomenal job of capturing resignation, nihilism and world weariness. Most of the song is just Kendrick detailing all the ways his life feels more empty, more meaningless, more dark. He's growing distant from friends and family, believing them to be growing more shallow. He's losing his patience, his focus, his sleep, growing more and more apathetic to the world around him. He's disillusioned with the music industry and wider systems of power, the darker aspects of pop culture, seeing the way that they proliferate themselves in the generations following him. And throughout the song, there's this repeated refrain: the whole world want me to pray for him, but who the fuck praying for me? I just have this image of Kendrick after To Pimp a Butterfly, finally on top of the world and looking down on it, eager to start rebuilding and make it better, only to realize the world itself is not rotten. That's just the way it is. And so he just accepts the feeling of an apocalypse happening, but nothing is awkward.
This feeling is explored more in Fear, which follows the aforementioned XXX and is arguably the album's centerpiece.
The song is structured into 3 verses, each one dealing Kendrick's fears over the course of 20 years, taking place at ages 7, 17, and 27 respectively.
The song is fittingly a very dark and dour one, but what's interesting are the voicemails that bookend the song.
These voicemails, sent by Kendrick's cousin Carl, are essentially a way for him to explain Kendrick's depression and dissatisfaction with the world as basically divine in origin. Carl is a Hebrew Israelite, someone who believes that African Americans, as well as sometimes other groups like Native Americans and Latinos, are the true descendants of the Israelites as described in the Bible. If you're at all familiar with those Hotep memes, those are kind of the same thing, I think.
To be clear, they don't identify as Jews. If anything, they kinda actually seem low-key anti-Semitic. From what I can tell, the whole movement seemed to start when some guy had a vision telling him that black people were actually the true Israelites. Well, actually not even black people, just black Americans, so I guess I'm not invited. I haven't done much research, but from the little I have, the whole thing just reads to me as a way to rationalize the trauma of slavery and the subsequent suffering by black people under the American state. Anyway, this ain't a history lesson. The important thing is what Carl says in the song Fear.
Carl says that the plight and suffering of the African American people is simply their natural condition as a result of their idolatry thousands of years ago. Their history of suffering, which continues to be written to this day, affecting all of them, including Kendrick himself, is a punishment given by God for this crime.
Putting aside the historical dubiousness of all that, it really does add a lot to this album's themes. The idea that Kendrick on this album views himself and his country as essentially cursed, that their suffering is the literal result of divine intervention, just adds to the hopelessness that hangs over this whole project, something that hits even harder when you take into account the cyclical nature of the project.
One of Damn's unique features as an album is that it is essentially 2 different albums depending on which order you play it in, something Kendrick has encouraged by releasing 2 different versions with the same track list in opposing orders. Played front to back, Damn is, as I described it, a rumination on hopelessness of struggling to keep faith in a cold world, gradually spiraling and getting darker and wider in its outlook, occasionally finding respite in things like love and faith, eventually culminating in the final track, Duckworth, which talks about the coincidences that led Kendrick to being in the place he is now. That being eventual top dog CEO Punch sparing the life of Kendrick's father Ducky, thus allowing Kendrick to continue on the path he walks today. I don't know if you can call this track resolution, but it does feel like it brings some kind of closure. Played front to back, however, things are very different. Following the alternate timeline where Ducky is shot by Punch, the story becomes a lot more personal, and these later somber tracks that acted as reflections of the earlier aggressive ones now turn into works of foreshadowing. Love, already a somewhat insecure ballad, descends into lust as Kendrick loses himself in the monotony and debauchery of his lifestyle. Humble reads less like an aggressive manifesto and more like a wild crash out that stumbles into pride and loyalty, where Kendrick finds himself doubting both himself and his relationship, before finally ending with him being shot in blood. Originally the album's intro, but here acting as the nail in the coffin of yet another black life wasted, denied a chance before it could even begin.
This whole thing is not only just a really great example of how important an artful album sequencing is, it also essentially puts the album in an endless loop, Duckworth forever rewinding back to blood, which just rolls naturally into DNA and continues the cycle. Unlike every Kendrick album before and after, there is no closure, no resolution, it just keeps going forever, a tortured man trapped in a world he hates and hates him back forever and ever. When you think about it like that, it's no wonder why, despite its mainstream appeal sonically, it is considered by many, including myself, to be Kendrick's grimmest, most distraught album emotionally. It's an album that only grows more fascinating and terrifying the more you listen to it. I can say I honestly believe it deserved to win that Pulitzer. If you're someone who dismissed Damn as Kendrick going pop, if you somehow haven't listened to it, or if you've only listened one way, maybe give the collector's edition a listen, see how that reverse tracklist hits different. Because make no mistake, hit different this album does. Even more so now than it did back then. History seemingly just as cyclical as Damn itself. I want to take this chance to acknowledge a few things. Firstly, if you're interested in learning more about Damn, I'd recommend going to this Reddit post, which acts as a kind of guide to the various potential listening experiences of Damn, as well as the video on the album by Tennis Tom. I deliberately avoided watching it until after I'd written the previous segment, but it covers similar ground, and if you're unsatisfied with the breadth of what I've done today, given that it was only one part of a larger video, then you can check out his deep dive to whet your appetite. Secondly, and get used to me talking about this a lot this year, I am very proud to plug King's Creek, a horror fiction podcast that I am producing with fellow YouTuber TSD Talks. Not to mention, I'm also composing for it as well. It's one of the main reasons I'm refraining from giving all my videos soundtracks this year like I did last. King's Creek follows Damien Bachman, who moves in with his aunt in a rural town in the Pacific Northwest, where he begins reading his dead uncle's old case files that detail some of the strange happenings in the town of King's Creek. If you're at all into shows like the Magnus Archive and other such media, then this should be right up your alley. I've left the trailer in the description below, not to mention in the end card of the video.
I also want to take this opportunity to shout out my patrons, especially my tier 3 patron Michael Coolwood, for their support as I worked on this video that ended up becoming far bigger than I ever intended when I started writing this. If you want to support me while also getting access to behind the scenes updates, early previews of videos and music, as well as credits in my videos, then you can pledge to my Patreon, which is in the description below. Again, thank you to all you guys for your support, and thank you to those who aren't patrons but are still watching the video thus far. If you like it, then comment any additional albums you think could fit under this umbrella I've established. One I wanted to talk about but couldn't find the place for was By the Time I Get to Phoenix, which is like a hip-hop themed nuclear wasteland. Great boundary pushing stuff, one of my favourite albums of all time. I'm so torn up that I can't talk about it right now. Just go listen to it.
And finally, I want to shout out my good friend Florian. We've been chatting for years at this point and are always giving each other different recommendations for films, shows, and especially music. Indeed, they're the one who put me on God's Country, Dark Times, and indirectly the last album, which we'll get to in a second, thus unintentionally playing a massive role in the creation of this very video, at least as it exists now. I've linked their channel in the description, give them some love. They deserve it, and a whole lot more. The reason I'm doing this now and not at the end of the video is partially because you're more likely to see it than if it were at the end, assuming you haven't skipped or left, of course, but also because I want to get everything miscellaneous and not specifically related to this video's topic and purpose out of the way now. And that is because for this final album, things are going to get real. And they're gonna get serious. Enough so that it'll feel weird talking about anything else afterwards. Something I hope you immediately understand once I introduce the album we'll be talking about. I am of course referring to the latest Godspeed You Black Emperor LP. No title as of 13 February 2024. 28,340 dead. Consider that a trigger warning.
Godspeed You Black Emperor is a legendary Canadian post-rock band known for their extremely long, ambient and atmospheric takes that at times almost feel like film scores, often making use of movements, field recordings and spoken word over traditional song components and structures.
I listened to their first album, F-sharp, A-sharp, Infinity, last year. Thank you, Florian, we all say in unison. And if any of the albums I've discussed today sound appealing to you, I highly recommend you check it out.
It is an extremely evocative and immersive body of music that feels like the soundtrack for a film that doesn't exist. It does a phenomenal job of painting this picture of a landscape in its dying throes, crippled and poisoned by corruption and capitalism. And in another timeline, I am absolutely making it the focus of this final chapter. But given that we've spent this whole time examining music that talks about the feeling of the end of the world, I felt that it was important that at some point we talk about those for whom the world doesn't just feel like it's ending, it actively is. On the 7th of October 2023, Palestinian militants led by Hamas launched a surprise attack on Israeli soil, the first such attack since 1948, leading to the deaths of 1,195 people and the capture of 251 hostages.
I remember reading about the attack and being shocked at the number of deaths. It almost didn't process. It just didn't seem believable at the time that so many people could just be gone in a single night. But unfortunately, in the coming months, a number like that will become much easier to process for all the worst reasons.
The Netanyahu government invaded the Gaza Strip with the stated purpose of defeating Hamas and rescuing the hostages. It quickly became apparent that they were far more preoccupied with the complete and total destruction of the Gaza Strip and even Palestine as a whole. And the reason I say this is not because I believe that this is what they were doing. It is because they told us that this is what they were doing.
Then Energy and now Defense Secretary Israel Katz openly stated his intent to deprive Gaza of water and power until they leave this world. This was in response to a tweet from a US congressman accusing his government of collective punishment, a war crime by the way. Minister of Agriculture Avi Dichter, by referencing the Nakba, called for the forcible displacement and ethnic cleansing of Gaza. Minister for Heritage Amihai Ilyahu who just straight up wanted to nuke him. Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich called for total annihilation and said that the starvation of 2 million people may be justified and moral. IDF Major General Gioria Eland said that Gaza will become a place where no human being can exist, and creating a severe humanitarian crisis in Gaza is a necessary means to achieving the goal. Mind you, hundreds of hostages were still there at the time. Ex-Defense Minister Yoshi Ya'alon openly accused his former government of not just leading the nation towards a path of ethnic cleansing and settler colonialism, but actively practicing said things right now. And I was going to include one more to drive home this point, but I could feel myself getting physically sick writing this, let alone saying it aloud, so I'll just put it here. Links to all these statements will be included in the description.
Regardless of their stated aims or intent, the Netanyahu government entered Gaza first and foremost to wipe it off the map. And at the time of recording, approximately 1 AM on the 12th of February 2025, the latest figures state that 62,614 people have been killed. However, given the many unverified and missing bodies likely trapped under rubble, the severe restriction of food, water and medical aid, the chaos of displacing close to every single person in one of the most densely populated areas on Earth, and the near total collapse of Gaza's infrastructure, it is likely that this number is a significant underestimation of the actual number, and indeed could climb much higher in the coming months and years, a massive proportion of which, given Gaza's extremely young population, are going to be and already are, children.
Of course, I would also be remiss not to point out the many Israelis who are also going to suffer and die as a result of the malicious actions of their government, who have gone out of their way to inflame and stoke regional tensions and conflict as much as they can, putting their own citizens in harm's way by encouraging them to settle in occupied territory, forever chasing a nationalistic ideal of what their country should be, knowingly endangering the one they actually have in the process. To any Israelis watching, know that I say this with 100% sincerity and with the best of intentions for you and your well-being. Your government does not care about equality, your government does not care about peace, and your government does not care about you. If the end of the world looks like anything, surely it looks like this. And while this is happening, for the average person, what is it that you can do to appropriately react to this? What can you do to even process the open scale of death and destruction, let alone do anything about it? This is clearly something that's been weighing on the minds of the members of Godspeed, well known for their openly political work.
The description on the album's Bandcamp page reads as follows. We drifted through it, arguing. Every day a new war crime, every day a flower bloom. We sat down together and wrote it in one room, then sat down in a different room, recording. No title equals what gestures make sense while tiny bodies fall, what context, what broken melody. And then a tally and a date to mark a point on the line, the negative process, the growing pile. The sun setting above beds of ash while we sat together, arguing. The old world order barely pretended to care. This new century will be crueler still. War is coming. Don't give up. Pick a side. Hang on. Love. Godspeed, you Black Emperor.
Going into this album, I was obviously a little trepidatious. It does not promise an easy listening experience, and yeah, I was mostly right. You will find no shortage of extremely unnerving and chilling moments on this record.
The opening, Sun is a Whole, Sun is Vapors, starts with this ominous buzzing that leads into these melancholy strings and electric guitars. It almost feels like a distorted and hollow anthem. Babies in a Thundercloud begins with literal bombs going off with these high-pitched drones before transitioning into these guitar riffs that almost sound like they were recording under the howls of fighter jets. Raindrops Cast in Lead is a piece that oozes tension. The first 2 minutes are a soundscape of beeps, strings, and rattling hi-hats, only for the listener to get jump-scared when the guitars and drums proper suddenly come in, massively picking up the pace before slowing down again to give space for a poem, the only spoken words on the album.
Translated from the Spanish it is performed in, it is very much a picture of the present situation in Gaza, of bodies falling from the sky, of people being martyred before their birth. I am especially drawn to the second half. The women who tried and were killed for trying. The women who died young, furious or old, and never saw the sunrise. Innocents and children, and the tiny bodies that laughed and will sleep forever, and never saw the beauty of the sunrise. After this, the song quickly picks up speed, getting faster and faster, louder and louder relentlessly. Listening to it, I can't help but feel my chest get tighter and tighter, until the song finally relents, abruptly stopping and fading as the last notes drone and linger in the air.
Broken Spires at Dead Capital is the shortest track, but the darkest and most sorrowful. It's a fuzzy ambience, with the only clean sounds being these incredibly mournful and dour strings, which are normally towards the higher range, but occasionally accented by deeper, bassy, more sinister tones. It feels like a marriage of overwhelming, crippling grief and visceral, churning rage that leads seamlessly into the following track, Pale Spectre Takes Photographs, which continues to paint an unsettling soundscape with the addition of these arpeggiating synthesizers which give way to walls of distorted guitars and heavy, thumping drums. Like previous tracks, it isn't long before a dreadful energy begins to pick up, with the ringing bells adding to this sense of imminent danger. Eventually, the song does give way to something smoother and elegant, but still with that pervasive sense of melancholy and trepidation. It's one of many moments on the album where you're on the edge of your seat, constantly strung along with this endlessly rising tension before finally release. The guitar and bass wearily closing out the track.
This leads us into the finale of the album, Grey Rubble and Green Shoots, which highlights an aspect of the album that I was unprepared for going into it, and that is, while it is extremely dense and dreadful, it also has the capacity to be beautiful.
The song begins with those now familiar guitars, but though the melody remains melancholic, it feels clearer and less distorted somehow. Even when the drums come in, the song somehow manages to avoid getting too heavy. Like those before it, it builds and builds, but this time there's a lot less tension and anxiety. There's almost a sense of grand finality, a rising, almost swelling sensation before suddenly coming down, fading into relaxed bass, strings and drums, and again, though the atmosphere is still far from jubilant, it's probably the first moment of genuine, unironic relief on the entire album. It brings to mind images of overlooking mass destruction, the weight of all that happened and all that's to come still present, still heavy, but for the first time, maybe easing. For the first time, you can breathe. For the first time, you can rest. And so, you do. You close your eyes, sinking into yourself, and maybe, just for a single moment, you find peace.
As I was writing this video, a multi-phase ceasefire deal was announced and came into force, which has seen an end to most hostilities and the start of the release of hostages after 15 months, hopefully continuing with an eventual IDF withdrawal, the allowing of critical aid to pass through the Gaza border, and the start of what is to be a long and grueling reconstruction process.
Now, this is far from the end of the issue. Despite the ceasefire, people are still being killed, aid is still being held up. Gaza is basically a giant pile of blood and rubble, and as long as the people who enable and encourage this conflict retain power, it will never end. But, for the first time in over a year, people can now breathe. For now, they can breathe. And for now, that is a relief. However small.
I worry that with all this focus on extremely depressing, angsty and angry music, that I may have created the impression that I am someone who just revels in this sort of stuff, that I am some kind of self-loathing edgelord who gets off on misery because they think it makes them more mature. And while yes, I was a teenager once, I am very thankful to say that no, that is not why I made this video.
There's the reason I mentioned in the intro, that there's a kind of catharsis in listening to music of this tone. In an age where it's almost impossible to avoid constant 24-hour news coverage by industries that, a lot of the time, deliberately try and make us angry by forcing the worst possible stories and interpretations of stories in our faces, you can easily be left feeling depressed, isolated and hopeless. But even just hearing someone echo these feelings, empathize with your concerns, it lets you know that you aren't alone, helps you articulate and reflect on those feelings. But there is another reason, one that is more political. I know, shocking. Art, to me, is just another word for expression. And expression is one of the most powerful forms of defiance and liberty in the world. There is no law, no creed that can truly contain our feelings.
Those feelings have and always will exist, and the expression of those feelings in art is an invaluable process of reflection on the world of the artist. It is through that process, that exploration of reflection, that we grow, that we learn, that we evolve as people. And those who hoard wealth for themselves, who burn and drain the earth for profit, who divide common people against themselves, who see human life as expendable or even conditional, those are the same people that would try and prevent that reflection, that expression, that which would make us look at ourselves and our surroundings and question things, that which would make us feel conflicted or unsure or messy or nuanced, make us see and consider beyond what we simply have now, that which makes us think and feel in ways they cannot control. In their perfect world, there would be no title, no damn, no humans, no dark times, no God's country. And yet, despite all the power those selfish people have accumulated, those works still exist. They were created, published, and appreciated. And that tells me that it isn't too late. A better future, more vibrant, beautiful, and harmonious than any other, is still possible. A world where such music, such art is still being made, is a world that can still be saved. Thank you so much for watching. Have a pleasant day. I'll see you soon. Bye bye.